The strangest part about calling a plumber at 2 a.m. was not the broken pipe. It was the fact that when everything was finally fixed, he still did not want to leave. My name is Ethan Brooks, and before that night, I never believed a simple emergency call could become a moment I would remember for years. It started like any other quiet night in my suburban home. I had spent the entire day catching up on work, trying to enjoy a little peace after a busy week. The house was silent, the neighborhood was calm, and I was ready to finally get some rest. Then I heard the sound of water dripping from somewhere near the kitchen. At first, I thought it was something minor. I checked the cabinets, looked around the area, and tried to figure out where the problem was coming from. But as the minutes passed, I realized I needed professional help. I looked at the clock and saw it was just after 2 a.m. I hesitated before making the call because I knew how unusual the timing was. I did not want to bother someone in the middle of the night, but I also knew I could not ignore the problem. After searching for a local emergency service, I finally made the call. That was when I first spoke to Caleb Morgan. His voice was calm and reassuring, and he told me he could come by and take a look. I expected someone who would arrive, fix the issue, and leave as quickly as possible. That was usually how these situations worked. A stranger shows up, solves a problem, and disappears from your life. But when Caleb arrived, my first impression was different. He was professional, friendly, and surprisingly easy to talk to. He introduced himself, explained what he was going to check, and immediately made the stressful situation feel less overwhelming. As he worked, we exchanged a few simple conversations. I learned that he had been repairing homes for several years and often worked late hours because emergencies did not always happen during convenient times. There was something about the way he talked that caught my attention. He did not seem like someone who only wanted to finish a job and move on. He seemed genuinely interested in the people he met along the way. After a while, the problem was resolved. I thanked him and expected him to pack up his tools and leave. But instead, Caleb stayed for a moment longer. He looked around the quiet house and asked if I usually lived alone. It was a simple question, but it surprised me because most people would have already been on their way home. I answered honestly and told him that I did. He nodded and mentioned that quiet nights like this could sometimes feel longer than people expected. That comment made me pause because it sounded less like a casual observation and more like something personal. We started talking for a few extra minutes. The conversation moved away from plumbing and into everyday life. We talked about work, routines, and how strange it was that two people who had never met before could end up having a meaningful conversation at such an unusual hour. I still did not know why Caleb stayed after his work was finished. I did not know what story he carried behind his calm personality. But as he stood by the door, preparing to leave, I had a feeling that this was not just another late-night service call. Something about that moment felt different. And I had no idea that the man who arrived to fix a problem in my house would soon become someone who changed the way I looked at unexpected connections. After Caleb finally left that night, I expected the memory of our conversation to fade away like most unexpected moments do. A stranger arrives, a problem gets solved, and life goes back to normal. At least that was what I thought would happen. But over the next few days, I found myself thinking about that late-night visit more than I expected. It was not because of the plumbing issue or the inconvenience that brought him to my house. It was because of the conversation we shared after everything was already fixed. There was something different about Caleb. He had a calm way of speaking that made people feel comfortable, and even though we had only known each other for a short time, talking with him felt surprisingly natural. A few days later, I received a message from the company confirming that the repair had been completed and asking if everything was working properly. I responded, and the exchange was simple and professional. But seeing Caleb's name reminded me of that night and the unusual feeling that came with it. Not long after that, I had another small issue around the house and decided to contact the same company again. I was not expecting Caleb to answer, but when he arrived, he recognized me immediately. He smiled and said he was glad everything had worked out. That small moment made me realize that he remembered our conversation too. This time, there was no emergency and no reason to rush. Caleb finished checking everything quickly, and we started talking again. The conversation felt easier than before because we were no longer complete strangers. I learned more about him, including how much he enjoyed meeting different people through his work. Caleb explained that repairing homes was not only about fixing physical problems. He often found himself listening to people's stories because every house had memories connected to it. Some people talked about their families, some shared their plans for the future, and others simply appreciated having someone to talk with during a stressful moment. I thought that was an interesting way to look at his job. Most people probably saw a plumber as someone who arrived, completed a task, and left. But Caleb saw his work as an opportunity to connect with people. As we talked, I noticed that he rarely spoke about himself unless someone asked. He was naturally curious about others, but he kept his own life more private. I asked him if he was always this comfortable talking with strangers. He laughed and said that he was not always like that. He explained that working with different people every day had taught him that everyone had a story, but not everyone had someone willing to listen. That answer stayed with me because it explained something I had noticed from the beginning. Caleb was not simply friendly because it was part of his job. He genuinely cared about the conversations he had with people. Before he left that afternoon, we talked for a few more minutes by the front door. It felt strange how quickly the conversation became comfortable, considering that we had only met because of an unexpected problem. After he walked away, I stood there thinking about how random moments can sometimes create connections we never planned for. Caleb had entered my life as someone I called for help, but he was slowly becoming someone I wanted to know better. I still wondered about the reason he had stayed that first night after the work was finished. I had a feeling there was more to that moment than I understood. And I knew that if I wanted the answer, I would have to learn more about the person behind the work clothes and the quiet smile. The more I talked with Caleb, the more I realized that the person I first met during that late-night repair was very different from the simple image I had created in my mind. At first, I only knew him as the plumber who arrived at an unusual hour and stayed longer than expected. But with each conversation, I discovered more about the person behind the tools, the work clothes, and the calm expression he always carried. One afternoon, after another visit to check something around the house, Caleb and I ended up talking longer than either of us expected. There was no urgent problem to solve this time. There was no reason for him to stay except that the conversation itself had become something we both enjoyed. We sat in the kitchen and talked about everyday things, from favorite places around town to the little routines that made life feel comfortable. I noticed that Caleb had a unique way of looking at ordinary moments. He appreciated simple things that many people overlooked. He said that working in different homes had taught him that every person had a completely different story. A house was never just walls and furniture. It was a place filled with memories, changes, and experiences that shaped the people who lived there. I thought that was an interesting perspective because most people did not think about their homes that way. They usually only noticed something when it stopped working. Caleb saw the deeper meaning behind the places he visited. During our conversation, I asked him how he became someone who was so comfortable talking with strangers. He smiled and admitted that it had taken him years to become that way. He explained that when he was younger, he often kept his thoughts to himself. He believed that showing too much of himself made him vulnerable to being misunderstood. Over time, however, he learned that real connections could only happen when people allowed themselves to be known. That answer surprised me because Caleb always appeared confident and relaxed. I had assumed that someone like him never struggled with uncertainty. But hearing him speak made me realize that confidence was not about never having doubts. It was about learning how to move forward despite them. I shared some of my own experiences with him. I told him that I had spent a long time focusing on responsibilities and routines, sometimes forgetting to make space for meaningful conversations. Caleb nodded and said that many people lived that way. They became so focused on getting through each day that they forgot how important it was to slow down and connect with others. That conversation stayed with me because it explained why talking with Caleb felt different. Neither of us was trying to impress the other person. We were simply sharing thoughts and experiences without worrying about how we would be judged. Before leaving, Caleb looked around the kitchen and smiled, mentioning that it was interesting how a small problem had created such an unexpected conversation. I agreed because I had been thinking the same thing. A few weeks earlier, He had been a complete stranger who arrived at my door in the middle of the night. Now, he was someone whose perspective I valued. As I watched him walk away, I found myself thinking about the strange way life creates connections. Sometimes people enter our lives because something goes wrong. But sometimes, the unexpected moments are exactly what lead us towards something we never knew we needed. After several conversations with Caleb, I began to understand that the most interesting part of knowing someone was not discovering the things they showed the world. It was discovering the things they usually kept hidden. Caleb had a natural ability to make people feel comfortable, but I started noticing that he was often better at listening than sharing. He asked thoughtful questions about my life, my experiences, and the things I hoped to accomplish, yet he rarely talked about himself unless someone showed genuine interest. That made me curious about the story behind the person who always seemed ready to understand everyone else. One evening, Caleb stopped by to check a small issue around the house. It was a simple visit, but like many of our conversations, it turned into something much longer. After he finished his work, we stayed in the kitchen talking. This time, I asked him more about his own life. At first, he smiled and said there was not much to tell. But after a few moments, he started sharing more than I expected. Caleb explained that he had always been the person others relied on. In his family and among his friends, he was often seen as the dependable one, the person who could handle problems and stay calm when things became complicated. He said he was proud of that, but sometimes he wondered if people only saw that one side of him. Hearing that made me think about how easy it is to place people into simple categories. Someone can appear confident, helpful, or successful, but that does not mean they do not have their own questions and challenges. Caleb admitted that there were times when he felt like he was constantly giving support to others without allowing anyone to understand what he needed. He said that over the years, he learned that being strong did not mean carrying everything alone. It also meant allowing yourself to be honest when life felt uncertain. That was something I understood because I had experienced similar feelings. I told him that I often focused so much on being responsible that I forgot how important it was to share thoughts with someone else. Caleb smiled and said that maybe this was why our conversations felt so natural. Neither of us was trying to present a perfect version of ourselves. We were simply two people having honest conversations. As the evening continued, Caleb told me that his late-night work schedule had given him many unexpected experiences. He met people during moments when they were usually more relaxed and less focused on appearances. He said that when people are caught in ordinary situations, they often reveal parts of themselves they do not usually show. I thought that explained why our friendship developed the way it did. We met during a moment when neither of us expected anything beyond a simple service call. There was no plan, no expectation, and no reason to think that a conversation would become meaningful. But sometimes the most genuine connections happen when people are not trying to create them. Before Caleb left that night, he thanked me for taking the time to talk with him. That surprised me because I felt like I was the one who should be grateful. He had entered my home as a stranger, but he had slowly become someone I trusted. After he left, I stood in the quiet house and thought about how much had changed since that first call. Caleb had arrived to solve a problem I could see, but along the way, he helped me notice something I had been missing for a long time. Sometimes people do not enter our lives because everything is going perfectly. Sometimes they arrive during unexpected moments and remind us that connection can appear when we least expect it. As the weeks passed, I started noticing that my conversations with Caleb were becoming something I looked forward to. It was not because we always talked about serious topics or shared dramatic stories. In fact, many of our conversations were about simple things. We talked about favorite places in town, old memories, daily routines, and the small moments that often went unnoticed. But somehow, those ordinary conversations became some of the most meaningful parts of my week. One evening, Caleb stopped by after I contacted the company for another small repair. The issue was minor, and I almost felt guilty calling because I knew it was not an urgent situation. Caleb laughed when I mentioned that and told me that helping people with small problems was part of his job too. He said that sometimes the little things were exactly what reminded people to slow down and pay attention to what was happening around them. After he finished checking everything, we sat down and continued talking like we had done before. This time, the conversation moved toward our past experiences and the choices that shaped who we had become. Caleb asked me if I had always imagined my life turning out the way it did. I thought about the question for a moment before answering. The truth was that my life looked very different from what I had imagined years earlier. I had focused so much on reaching certain goals that I rarely stopped to consider whether I was actually enjoying the journey. Caleb understood what I meant because he had experienced something similar. He told me that for a long time, he believed success meant constantly moving forward without looking back. He worked hard, stayed busy, and tried to become someone others could depend on. But eventually, he realized that always being productive did not automatically mean he was living a fulfilling life. That realization changed the way he viewed his time and relationships. I found it interesting because Caleb seemed like someone who had everything figured out. He was patient, thoughtful, and comfortable around people. But hearing him talk reminded me that everyone has moments of uncertainty, even those who appear the most confident. During that conversation, we discovered that we both shared a similar habit. We were both good at listening to others, but not always good at expressing our own thoughts. Caleb said that many people spend years learning how to support others while forgetting that they also deserve support. That idea stayed with me because it felt true. There was something comforting about talking with someone who understood that feeling without needing a long explanation. As the evening continued, Caleb told me that one reason he enjoyed his work was because every day brought a new story. He never knew who he would meet or what conversation might happen. He said some of the most memorable moments in his life came from unexpected encounters with people he never planned to meet. I realized that our situation was exactly like that. Neither of us expected a late-night repair call to lead to a friendship built on honest conversations. Before leaving, Caleb paused at the door and thanked me for being someone who actually listened. I smiled because I felt the same way about him. He had given me something I did not realize I needed, which was a reminder that meaningful connections do not always begin with big moments. Sometimes they begin with a simple conversation, a little curiosity, and the willingness to see another person beyond the role they appear to have. As I watched Caleb walk away, I thought about how different everything felt compared to that first night. He was no longer just the person who came to fix a problem. He was someone whose story had become connected to mine in a way I never expected. The more time I spent talking with Caleb, the more I realized that our connection had reached a point where the small details mattered more than the reason we first met. What started as a late-night service call had slowly transformed into something I never expected. Caleb was no longer just someone who helped with problems around my house. He had become someone whose thoughts, experiences, and perspective made me see everyday life differently. One evening, after another casual conversation, I noticed that Caleb seemed quieter than usual. He was still friendly and calm, but there was something different in the way he answered my questions. Instead of immediately asking about my day like he normally did, he seemed lost in his own thoughts. I asked if everything was okay, and after a moment of silence, he admitted that he had been thinking about the direction of his life. Caleb explained that he had spent many years focusing on being useful to others. His work allowed him to help people every day, and he enjoyed knowing that he could make someone's situation easier. But sometimes he wondered if people knew the person behind the service he provided. He said that when you spend most of your time solving problems for others, it can become easy to forget about your own needs. I understood what he meant because I had experienced something similar. I told him that there were times when I became so focused on responsibilities that I forgot to ask myself whether I was truly happy. Caleb nodded and said that was exactly the feeling he had been trying to understand. He was grateful for his life, but he wanted to make sure he was not simply moving through each day without appreciating it. That conversation felt different from the ones we had before because Caleb was sharing a side of himself that I had not seen. Until that moment, I had always viewed him as someone who had a natural confidence and a clear sense of direction. But I realized that confidence did not mean someone never had doubts. It simply meant they were willing to face those doubts honestly. Caleb told me that meeting different people through his work had taught him something important. Everyone was carrying something, whether it was a dream, a worry, or a question about the future. Most people only showed the parts of themselves they felt comfortable sharing, but beneath that surface, Everyone was trying to figure things out. Hearing him say that made me think about how often we judge people based on a small part of their story. We see someone's job, their personality, or the way they present themselves, and we assume we understand them. But Caleb reminded me that every person has layers that are invisible at first. Before leaving that night, Caleb thanked me for giving him a place where he could speak openly. I told him that I felt the same way about our conversations. He had entered my life because of a problem I needed solved, but he had stayed because we both found something meaningful in simply talking. After he left, I thought about the strange path that brought us to that moment. A random call in the middle of the night had created a friendship built on honesty and understanding. I still wondered about the reason he had stayed that first night after finishing his work. But now I was beginning to understand that maybe the answer was not just about him. Maybe it was about both of us finding a connection at a time when we did not even realize we needed one. By this point, my conversations with Caleb had become a natural part of my routine. What surprised me the most was how something that began with a simple repair had turned into a connection built on trust and understanding. I never expected a person who arrived at my home during the middle of the night to become someone whose words would stay with me long after our conversations ended. But Caleb had a way of making ordinary moments feel meaningful. One evening, we found ourselves talking about the choices that shape a person's life. The conversation started with something simple, but it slowly moved into deeper thoughts about change, growth, and the moments that make people reconsider their direction. Caleb told me that for many years, he believed life was about reaching a point where everything finally made sense. He thought there would be a moment when he would have all the answers and feel completely certain about the future. But as he got older, he realized that life was not about reaching a perfect destination. It was about learning from each experience and becoming more comfortable with uncertainty. I understood that feeling because I had spent a lot of time believing that I needed a clear plan for everything. I thought being prepared meant knowing exactly where I was going next. But meeting Caleb showed me that sometimes the most important moments happen when we do not have everything planned. Caleb explained that his work had changed the way he viewed people. Every home he visited represented a different life, and every person had something that shaped who they were. He said that some of the most memorable conversations he had were not about the problems he was there to fix. They were about the stories people shared while he was there. That made me think about our own situation. If that late-night problem had never happened, we probably would have never met. A random moment had created a connection that neither of us could have predicted. I asked Caleb if he ever wondered why certain people enter our lives at specific times. He smiled and said he had thought about that many times. He believed that some people appear when we need a different perspective or a reminder of something we have forgotten. He did not describe it as something planned or guaranteed. He simply believed that every interaction had the potential to teach us something. That idea stayed with me because it changed the way I looked at our friendship. I stopped seeing Caleb as just an unexpected person who came into my life. Instead, I started seeing him as someone who represented a lesson I needed to learn. He reminded me to slow down, listen more carefully, and pay attention to the people around me. As our conversation continued, Caleb admitted that he was grateful for the chance to know me as well. He said that sometimes the person who listens to you can make just as much of an impact as the person who helps you. I appreciated hearing that because it showed me that our connection was not one-sided. We had both gained something from knowing each other. When Caleb finally prepared to leave that evening, there was a comfortable silence between us. It no longer felt like two people trying to understand each other. It felt like two friends who had already shared many important moments. After he walked away, I thought about the strange path that brought us together. A small problem in my home had introduced me to someone who changed the way I viewed unexpected connections. And for the first time, I was no longer wondering why Caleb had stayed that first night. I was starting to understand that sometimes people stay because a conversation becomes something neither person wants to end. As time went on, I began to notice how much my perspective had changed since the night Caleb first arrived at my door. At the beginning, I only saw the situation for what it appeared to be. There was a problem in my home. I needed help, and a professional came to fix it. It was simple, practical, and something I thought I would forget after a few days. But life has a strange way of turning ordinary moments into memories that stay with us. Caleb had become someone I genuinely looked forward to talking with. Our conversations were never forced. We did not need a special reason to sit down and share thoughts about life. Sometimes we talked about important decisions, and other times we simply talked about small things that happened during our week. Those simple conversations became reminders that meaningful connections do not always come from dramatic moments. Sometimes they grow quietly through consistency and trust. One evening, Caleb and I talked about how much people change over time. He mentioned that he often thought about the person he used to be compared to the person he was becoming. He said that when he was younger, he spent a lot of energy trying to meet expectations that were not always his own. He wanted to be successful, dependable, and someone others could count on. While those qualities were important, he eventually realized that he also needed to understand what made him personally happy. I thought about my own life and realized I had done something similar. There were times when I focused so much on responsibilities that I forgot to ask myself what experiences truly mattered to me. Caleb said that one of the biggest lessons he learned was that people should not wait for a perfect moment to appreciate their lives. The perfect moment rarely arrives exactly when we expect it. Instead, people have to recognize the value in the moments they already have. That idea stayed with me because it explained why our friendship felt so meaningful. Neither of us planned for this connection. It was not something we searched for. It simply developed because two people were willing to have honest conversations. During that evening, Caleb also told me something that made me think about our first meeting. He said that sometimes people enter our lives during moments when we are more open than usual. A person might meet us during a difficult day, a quiet evening, or a completely unexpected situation. Those moments can create opportunities for conversations that might never happen under normal circumstances. I realized that was exactly what happened between us. The timing of our meeting was unusual, but maybe that was part of what made it memorable. As the night continued, we talked about the future. Caleb said he wanted to continue growing, not just professionally but personally. He wanted to experience more, meet more people, and remain open to unexpected opportunities. I told him that I felt the same way. Knowing him had reminded me that life could still surprise me in positive ways. Before Caleb left, we stood near the doorway for a moment, both recognizing that our friendship had become something neither of us expected. There was no need for a big explanation or a dramatic goodbye. We simply understood that this connection mattered. After he walked away, I looked around my home and thought about how different everything felt. The same place where I once noticed only a problem had become the place where I met someone who changed my outlook. Caleb did not just fix something in my house. He helped me notice something I had been missing in my own life. And as I looked ahead, I knew that whatever happened next, I would always remember the unexpected person who arrived when I least expected it and stayed long enough to make a difference. Looking back now, I still find it surprising how a simple moment in the middle of the night became one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. When Caleb first arrived at my home, I saw him as a professional who was there to solve a problem. I expected a quick visit, a completed repair, and a goodbye. I never imagined that the person who walked through my door that night would become someone who changed the way I understood connection, timing, and the stories people carry with them. Over time, Caleb and I built a friendship that was based on something simple but powerful: taking the time to truly listen. We did not become close because of one dramatic moment. We became close because of many small conversations that allowed us to understand each other better. Every time we talked, I learned something new about him, and I also discovered something new about myself. Caleb taught me that people are often much more complicated than the first impression they create. A person's job, appearance, or daily routine only shows one small part of who they are. Behind every person is a collection of experiences, hopes, doubts, and memories that shape the way they see the world. Before meeting Caleb, I did not always take the time to look beyond the surface. Like many people, I was often busy with my own responsibilities and routines. But knowing him reminded me that every interaction has the potential to become meaningful if we are willing to slow down and pay attention. Caleb also changed the way I viewed unexpected moments. I used to think that important experiences had to be planned. I believed the biggest changes in life came from major decisions or carefully prepared opportunities. But my friendship with Caleb showed me that sometimes the moments that matter most happen when we are simply responding to what life places in front of us. A late-night problem, an unexpected conversation, and two people willing to share their thoughts created something neither of us predicted. One day, Caleb and I talked about how strange it was that our paths crossed in such an ordinary way. He smiled and said that maybe the best connections are the ones we never see coming. I agreed because that was exactly what happened between us. Neither of us searched for this friendship, but both of us were open enough to recognize its value when it appeared. As time passed, Caleb remained someone I appreciated not because he had all the answers, but because he was honest about the questions he was still exploring. He reminded me that growth is a continuous process and that nobody has everything figured out. We are all learning, changing, and discovering new parts of ourselves along the way. When I think about that first night, I no longer remember it as a simple problem that needed to be fixed. I remember it as the beginning of a connection that taught me an important lesson. Sometimes people enter our lives in unexpected ways, and sometimes those people help us notice things we have overlooked about ourselves. Caleb arrived as someone I called for help, but he left a lasting impact that went far beyond the original reason we met. The greatest lesson I learned was that every person has a story, and sometimes the most meaningful stories begin with the most unexpected encounters. What started as a quiet night at home became a reminder that connection can appear anywhere, at any time, when two people are willing to see each other as more than just strangers.